Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lawrence Speranza, Director of the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today at the 2030 NATO Youth Summit, which is such an important initiative to help shape NATO's future with the next generation of transatlantic leaders who will soon take the alliance's reins. This particular discussion is focused on how to defend NATO in 2030. And as we think about where the alliance's defense and deterrence efforts are today, it's clear that NATO has come a long way. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and illegal annexation of Crimea back in 2014, the alliance went back to basics to focus on conventional defense and deterrence at home in Europe. And since then, NATO has been working to implement the largest reinforcement of its collective defense since the Cold War, as allied governments agreed that a new era of great power competition was being ushered in. And while those efforts continue to be paramount to our shared security, today we're recognizing that even those conventional efforts are not enough as the alliance faces new threats. To name a few, hybrid threats, including disinformation and cyber attacks, not only from Russia, but from China and others, disruptive technologies, terrorism, and even public crises, as we've seen with the coronavirus pandemic. All of these challenges pose certain risks to allied security. And as these threats continue to evolve and intensify over the next decade, we have more work to do to figure out what defending the alliance should really look like in the future. What threats will NATO be facing 10 years on, and what should NATO's role be or not be in tackling those issues? And we need help from all of you today to help shape that conversation. To guide our discussion today, we have three stellar panelists: Dr. Bastian Giegerich, Director of Defense and Military Analysis at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London; Commander Helena Linder-Jeß, Deputy Naval Attachée at the German Embassy in Washington, who was also the first female commanding officer of the German Navy; and Rachel Rizzo, Director of Programs at the Truman National Security Project. They will be standing by to answer your questions, which I encourage all of you to start submitting in written form right away, even now, via the Q&A function at the left side of your screen, which is available to our registered participants. We want this to be as interactive as possible, so please include your name and your country, and I'll pose those questions to our speakers for you. But before we dive into the back and forth, we have a special spotlight address to help frame our discussion from none other than the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Secretary Pompeo previously served as director of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and as a former congressman, and today he brings to us the ever-important U.S. perspective on NATO. I'll come to our panelists for some immediate reactions to that in a minute, but first, let's listen in to Secretary Pompeo now.
Hello, everyone. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo here. Congratulations on your participation in the NATO 2030 Young Leaders Group. You're about to discuss the next decade of the most successful military alliance in history. So I'd like to lay out three ideas. First, it's critical for you, as leaders, to analyze the world as it is, not as you wish it were. From confronting the Soviet Union to continue to stand united against Russian aggression and terrorist threats, we've been most effective when we honestly assess the challenges that we're facing. Strength and unity of vision remain critical as we dedicate ourselves to understanding and resisting the number one threat to freedom in our time, the Chinese Communist Party. Second, we all have to shoulder the responsibilities of freedom, every one of us. That's the only way to sustain NATO's 71-year success through 2030 and make the alliance even stronger for the next generation. We must also share the burdens of defense, meeting spending commitments, and never surrender to people who say appeasement can achieve good security outcomes. It won't. History shows that this strategy always fails in the long run. Third, we should never forget the principles that undergird this alliance. Freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and international peace and security can never be taken for granted. These principles, these three ideas are worth studying, and we should defend our shared values in the public square every chance that we get, and do so without apology. As I said at the Munich Security Conference in February, the West is winning. You all represent the future of NATO. It'll be up to you to make sure that we continue to win. Good luck.
Well, thank you very much to Secretary Pompeo for those remarks to help us kick off here. I think it's really important that he highlighted the principles upon which NATO was founded and which still remain relevant today. And great to hear his perspective as the U.S. role in the alliance, which was at the top of everyone's minds in the wake of the U.S. presidential elections last week. So I want to come back to that later on. But for now, let's keep the questions coming in. We have an extremely short period of time, so I'll ask everyone to keep their comments as brief as possible, no more than a minute or two per question. To get our discussion going, Bastian, let me come to you first. Secretary Pompeo talked about taking the world as it is. So maybe you could react to how NATO is doing today in delivering on its core function of defense and deterrence, and then maybe offer your perspectives on what should NATO's priorities be in the traditional military sense based on the threats it will face going forward.
Yeah, Lauren, thank you very much. Happy to do so. I mean, Secretary General Stoltenberg has said that for 2030, NATO's vision needs to be about three main things, really. Remaining militarily strong, being more united, and being more global in its approach. And I think Secretary of State Pompeo has just given us a slightly different take on that by saying, essentially, between now and 2030, it is about deterring Russia and finding an answer to whether or not NATO wants to contribute to containing China. And the question, therefore, is how is that being achieved? How does that mesh with political unity and that broader approach that the Secretary General has been speaking about? And I don't think that's an easy answer, actually. In terms of the capability gaps, I think, in terms of where we are right now, I think the key challenge is to recognize that as many European NATO allies, at least, move from what have been described as the sunset, so that the traditional capability set, to a more forward-looking, technology-heavy capability set, there's that moment of vulnerability where we are facing peak Russian capability, an emerging Chinese global presence, and the question is how to manage that transition. And some of the perhaps more traditional capability priorities would be, I think, to boost anti-submarine warfare capabilities, to invest in long-range precision fires. At one point, the air and tactical missile defense of Europe was one of NATO's primary critical tasks. It's now perhaps re-emerging as a priority after comparative neglect. One has to say that. Equally urgent is the accelerated deployment of electronic warfare and cyber capabilities. Others, I'm sure, will speak about this. Situational awareness from a strategic to the tactical level is a core capability, both in terms of deterrence and in terms of warfighting, and that is really an area where European inventories, at least, are inadequate. Funding on logistics, and even some really basic things like recapitalizing the fleet of armored vehicles in Europe. Unfortunately, all of this is on NATO's to-do list.
Thank you so much, Bastian. That was really helpful and really concrete focus on those capabilities. So thank you for laying that out. Commander Linder-Jeß, I would like to come to you next. And, Secretary Pompeo mentioned resilience in his comments in the context of China, but one of our participants also has a question about resilience and how it relates to NATO. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the role of resilience is in ensuring defense and deterrence. What does resilience mean when we're talking about traditional defense versus non-traditional or hybrid threats? Because we say this word a lot. There was a big focus on resilience at the last NATO Defense Ministerial meeting. But what does that really mean to you?
Thanks, Lauren. I'm happy to speak about that a little bit. Resilience actually is something we already have, and we're not as bad as we always think we are if we look at the resilience of NATO. But one very important component, I think, that is always a little bit in the back is the importance of training. We do that a lot in NATO. We have the standing NATO groups training. We have all services of the armed forces training together. But I think we really need to do more of that because we have a saying in the military, train as you fight. And I believe we're not yet doing that. And that means we need to do more training, but we also need to put more focus on how we do it and also look at how we fund the training, because it's we can always go on training and do a little bit here and a little bit there. But if we don't do it as if it was real, we're not gonna meet this goal to become 100% resilient. So, okay, 100% resilient is a nice goal, but I think training is the most important factor, in my opinion. So from a military point of view, I can say that's working quite well, but the factors I just mentioned need to go up. So that was a very short answer on how I think resilience. Do I have more time?
Super. No, that's really helpful, I think, to get us started. And I think we'll unpack this a little more as we go along. But because also, of course, we think about resilience in terms of resilience to disinformation and some other hybrid threats, resilience in the cyber domain, as you mentioned. So I think there's a lot more ways we can think about what resilience means. But that's very helpful to get us started. Rachel, I wanted to come to you. Of course, welcome any reactions to Secretary Pompeo, but you recently wrote a great article alluding to how the next generation of transatlantic leaders is often less concerned with some of these core military issues and more passionate about some of the non-traditional issues, which seem to be increasingly important for our future security environment. And I actually just released a new paper at SIPA this morning, finding an agenda for NATO's next generation, and it also advocates for incorporating things like the effects of climate change, disinformation, human security on the priority list as well. So how can NATO as a military alliance start to work in some of these unconventional security items to its broader defense agenda as we look to 2030?
So that's a great question. And I wanted to offer a quick response to Secretary Pompeo's opening statement. Something that I found very interesting is that he said, we have to see the world as it is, not as we wish it were. My question, I think, is, do different generations view the world differently? And what does that mean for things like alliance cohesion and the future of NATO? So something for all of the young leaders joining us today to think about. I think if there's anything that we've seen over the last couple of years is that threats not only change, they compound. So that means that while conventional means of deterrence are still important, Russia, for example, and the threats that it poses to European stability and the NATO alliance aren't going anywhere. On top of this, we're going to see new threats, which will test NATO's ability to adapt, but then force NATO to ask itself, what are we? What do we do? And more importantly, what do we not do? So over the last year or so, we've seen COVID-19, China, climate change, populism. None of these are threats for which NATO was created to address. But if NATO doesn't adapt to address them, it risks becoming static and irrelevant. And more so, we risk losing the next generation of national security practitioners. So I think that NATO has to focus on partnering with organizations like the European Union, like the WHO, like the WTO. I thought that the young leader who mentioned that the EU should have a permanent seat on the NAC, I thought that was a really interesting point. So I think that NATO is beginning to have these conversations, and the way forward is it's going to look a lot different than the last 20 or 30 years. But we have to be okay with shaking things up a little bit and maybe getting out of the traditional opinion that the main focus of NATO should be Russia and Russian deterrence.
Thanks, Rachel. That's really helpful. Brian, one of our audience members has also asked about the emerging and disruptive technologies question and how that will impact the defense of the alliance. And we talked a bit about this morning with Secretary General Stoltenberg, but in your view, what does NATO need to do to maintain its competitive edge going forward? Are we innovating enough to develop new capabilities like hypersonic missiles and cyber capabilities and AI to compete with Russia and China? What defense tech capabilities should NATO prioritize in the future?
Should I start on this?
Yes.
Well, look, I think one of the issues is that the U.S. has decided that it is really going to try and make sure that there remains a gap between U.S. capability and what the U.S. considers its peer. so primarily China, but also to a degree Russia. And that, I think, creates an interoperability challenge for the alliance, because it means that other alliance members need to make sure they catch up, or they not they catch up, but that they remain that there remains connectivity between what the US does and what other allies do. And I think the reality for a lot of the other allies is that by themselves as individual nations, they're probably too small to achieve the scale effects that one needs to make some of these investments in future capabilities. So I really think there's a strong argument to use NATO, but also the European Union, to really collaborate around some of these areas of new technology, to make sure that it can be leveraged for alliance purposes. And NATO is working on AI in particular at the moment, and other areas. So I think that's a good path to pursue. At the same time, I would say that if we project ourselves forward to 2030, a lot of the capability that we will see in 2030 is the capability that we will see now. If you ask, a chief of a navy of what his navy will, or her navy will look like, Helena, in 2030, it will look a lot like the navy today. Because a lot of the kit that will be in that navy is already there. So I think we need to manage that transition towards what is new, while making sure that what we have actually is ready and serviceable for the purpose that we have defined as an alliance.
Thank you, Bastian.
Absolutely. Can I chip in on that, what Bastian just said? Yes, I absolutely believe, I'm just going to underline what you said, Bastian, because I think the evolving nature of threats shows us that we have to adapt to and get creative on how we deal with the future threats, because they will definitely be hybrid, and we will definitely need to use AI, and so there's no question on that. But I believe that a couple of things will change. It's not all there yet. And one thing we really need to work on is information sharing inside the alliance. It's nice to have good ideas and to sit on a committee and do all the theoretical stuff. But in the end, we have to share the information we have. And if that process takes us too long, we're not going to get where we want to go to. So it's just the little things in between we need to look for as well.
Absolutely, Helena. And actually, could I follow up on that to get your take on a related question? We're having these discussions about complementarity and reinforcing and making sure we're interoperable. And one of our participants, Luca from Croatia, has asked about how NATO can manage increased European interest in achieving strategic autonomy with the growing need to invest in more of a common defense. I would actually argue that the two don't have to be mutually exclusive, and actually they should be reinforcing each other. So how can we make sure that NATO and the EU and all the European defense initiatives that are happening are reinforcing the alliance, and that we're working together to achieve our common defense?
Thank you for that question. I think that the European pillar of NATO definitely has to be strengthened, and that Europe itself has to take over more responsibility looking at the eastern flank especially. And I think that's in the interest of all of us. And that is clear. But I also think that we shouldn't be looking too much on the numbers all the time. So if we talk about the 3 Cs, as Secretary Pompeo also kind of mentioned in his statement in the beginning, we shouldn't always look at cash. We also need to look at the capabilities, and we also need to look at the contributions. And then if you do so, if you look at all of them, you will see that European countries are doing something. So I believe that the European pillar of NATO is quite strong already, and there's no doubt about it that it has to become stronger, definitely. But yeah, let me say it like that.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Rachel, maybe we could zoom out just one level higher and kind of talk about the political state of the alliance. I think, as we saw the outcomes of the U.S. elections, there was a bit of a sigh of relief that you could hear across the alliance with the election of President-elect Joe Biden. But What do you think that this actually means for the political will and the unity between Europe and the United States? I mean, can we really get our leaders to agree to these defense priorities for the alliance? Are we on the same page? What do you think?
So there's a series of issues here that I think we're going to be focusing on over the first year or two of the Biden presidency. First is that we're going to see the U.S. recommit to the NATO alliance. I think that if there's one thing that we've learned over the past 3 or 4 years, it's that rhetoric really matters. And while there might not be any specific policy decisions that the Trump administration has made to undermine NATO, besides the German troop movements, what we say and how we speak about our European allies really matters, and it can undermine alliance cohesion. On top of this, when we have a president who is supposed to be leading the country who really, which is the backbone of NATO, when we see the president of our cozy up to authoritarian leaders, it really brings a question into the forefront of our minds, which is, you know, if NATO is just a military alliance, which I don't think it is, I think it's much bigger than that. How do we balance between, countries that represent Western ideals and democracy and countries that are within the alliance who are maybe teetering on the edge of that? So I think that we'll see a U.S. president that is much more committed to not only the NATO alliance, but democratic ideals. And hopefully that creates a situation where, European countries can feel more supported and will feel, less comfortable cozying up to authoritarians. Now, how that translates into, what NATO does over the next couple of years is yet to be seen. But I think we'll see much more pressure towards certain countries in the next couple of years. And I think it's long overdue as well.
Thanks, Rachel. And thanks to Gabriela Gricius from the United States for that question about how our allies can agree on these threats. There's a few other questions coming in. I know we're getting down to the wire here in terms of time, but I wanted to go back to something that Helena raised when we were talking about contributions and the infamous burden sharing issue. And I think, to Secretary Pompeo's point and what you highlighted, Rachel, about taking the world as it is, there's some really hard realities that we need to face right now about how we're dealing with the pandemic and the follow-on effects of that, whether that's economic impacts and the recessions that we're seeing. This is going to have it's going to take away some of the demands and the resources that political leaders have to focus on concerns at home, domestic issues coming out of the pandemic. So my question is, can we really muster the resources to make all of this happen, given all of the practical kind of political constraints on our leaders? So Helena, I don't know if you have some thoughts on that, or if others would like to chime in.
Well, I definitely think that this pandemic has, put us all in a situation where we need to look at what is really important and where we put the money, because a lot of money has gone away and the economies have been weakened. And that might also be a reason why defense spending percentages have gone up, although nothing, in fact, has changed if you look into the details. I believe that we cannot leave out of sight the challenges we face in the world. Now, we have the pandemic, which is one huge challenge, but the others are not going to go away. And it would be a massive failure to neglect other important factors and other threats and challenges which are coming up. And so many of them have been mentioned, be it I don't want to mention it all again. So we've spoken about the challenges, in fact, and there are certain priorities, and the priorities differ for everybody or for most of the countries. But defense spending has to stay as it is, or even go up as agreed to. And I think there's no doubt about that.
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, I have one last question from Renee from Germany here. And Bastian, maybe you can take this for us. In your view, what role will nuclear weapons play in defending NATO in 2030? Will the function of nuclear deterrence rise or decline in prominence?
Thank you. A very, very interesting, but also very difficult question. I mean, we now have, of course, in January, we will see a treaty coming into force that technically should have an impact on how existing nuclear weapon states deal with the question of disarmament and the role of nuclear weapons. We have, at the same time, though, a near total erosion of the arms control architecture that has guided us over the past decades, which creates all sorts of uncertainty and instability. And NATO has a very clear position that it will remain a nuclear alliance as long as nuclear weapons do play a role. Now, one can argue, is that a bit of a chicken and an egg problem? Who should move first? But I think the reality is that the great powers of the world all have well thought out and depending on how you look at it, fortunately or unfortunately, well-funded plans to modernize their nuclear weapons capability. So I don't think this is something that will go away. I think we will see it will have a different quality and a different posture 10, 15 years from now. What that means for NATO strategy, I think remains to be seen. But I do think there is a risk that new technologies that some of them we've spoken about, matched with nuclear weapons, do become a factor of instability. So it's something we need to watch very closely over the next couple of years. And I want to, if I may, just 30 seconds to tie back into something that Rachel talked about, because I think it's fair to say that President Trump might have created a coherence challenge in NATO, but he did not create the capability challenge. That was there. And that remains there, and so independent actually of who occupies the White House. So I think that and nuclear weapons fits into that challenge as well. So we need to focus on that. We cannot assume we'll now move into some sort of happy equilibrium where all the difficult questions go away.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point. And Rachel, I know you've written on this a bit too, just about how it's not that things will go back to the way they were perhaps 4 years ago in the transatlantic relationship, but we're facing a reality that has fundamentally changed. And the transatlantic partnership will reflect that going forward. Well, I know we have just a couple of minutes left. We still have a minute if anyone would like to submit a couple more questions here from our audience. But in the meantime, to help round off our discussion, I would love to do one last lightning round to hear from each of you, perhaps one challenge that you think will be different about the security environment in 2030. How it will be different from 2020. What's the one thing to watch for in 2030 that we don't see or maybe are not emphasizing enough here in 2020? Maybe Rachel, we could start with you.
So this is a security challenge that I think we are starting to focus on, but I think will be much more prevalent in 10 years. And that is how authoritarian states use security or use technology to undermine democracy, and what that means for the future of liberalism and illiberalism. So I think over the next 10 years, the US and the EU, who develop a lot of these technologies and then export them to certain countries, are going to have to really take a step back and look at how these technologies are being used by authoritarian leaders to, say, track their citizens or hold on to their power when otherwise democratic movements might have said otherwise. And so I think that that's one thing that we aren't focusing as much on today as we should be, but it's finally starting to get more attention. And in the next 10 years, we'll get even more attention.
Super. Thank you. Helena, over to you.
Yes, well, I would say that we have been talking a lot about emerging technologies, but I think that is only part of the whole issue. We haven't been talking enough about space and the use of space for future warfare. So I believe in 10 years, space will be a very important factor. And that is not for, maybe not for all countries in the world, because not everybody has the possibilities to use space in 10 years, but we might want to watch out for those who can.
Super. Thank you. Bastian, last thought over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. The connection is breaking up a little bit, so I hope you can still hear me. Let me just pick up where Helena just left off and say, I think one of the things that we all know we need to focus on, cyber and space. I think we need to broaden out our conversation from the technology aspects into making sure that we have the doctrines in place, the training in place, the understanding of how that technology actually forms part of capability, rather than have a narrow focus on the technology itself. That will help us to be better prepared in 2030. I earlier said a lot of the capabilities that we have now will still be around in 2030, but I think that will be an important element in moving us towards that future that we've been talking about. Thank you.